when the anxious walks away, the avoidance nightmare begins, we often talk about attachment styles like they're static, like someone is just anxious and someone else is just avoidant. And that's the end of the story. But today, I want to talk about what happens when that anxious partner, the one who always reaches out, who always over-explains, always forgives, finally walks away. Because that's when everything changes. The anxious person, for so long, is the emotional safety net. They're the ones who apologize first. They hold the relationship together even when it's falling apart. They chase, they hope. They hurt, but they stay. And here's the catch: the avoidant person. The one who needs space, who shuts down emotionally, who keeps love at arm's length. They start believing this will always be the dynamic, that no matter how much they pull away, someone will always pull harder to stay close. But what happens when that stops? What happens when the anxious person has nothing left to give? When they get tired of fighting for scraps of attention? When they finally convince themselves that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself? That's when the avoidant wakes up. That's when the silence that used to feel peaceful now sounds like a scream. That's when distance, which once gave them comfort, becomes a void they don't know how to fill. Because here's the truth on avoidance: fear engulfment, but they never expect abandonment. They never think the person who once begged for love would one day walk away quietly. Not with a fight, not with drama, just with clarity and dignity. And that is the moment their nightmare begins, because suddenly they realize that they weren't afraid of being smothered. They were afraid of being truly seen. And now that they've lost the one person who really tried to understand them, they see how much it hurts to be alone by choice. Only now it's not their choice anymore. So, if you're the anxious one and you're finding the courage to walk away, you're not weak. You're not crazy. You're not asking for too much. You're healing. And if you're the avoidant, this is your moment to grow, not to chase Anik, not to manipulate or breadcrumb, but to finally face the part of you that pushes love away before it can truly get close. Because when the anxious walks away, it's not just an ending. It's an invitation for someone to finally evolve. In many relationships, particularly those shaped by attachment styles, the anxious partner often becomes the emotional engine that keeps the connection going. They're the ones who initiate conversations after fights, who ask, "Can we talk?" Even when they're exhausted, they apologize first, sometimes for things they didn't even do, just to restore harmony. They send long texts trying to explain their feelings, hoping the other person will finally understand. They stay up at night wondering what they did wrong, when in truth, all they did was care too much in a space that gave them too little. This pattern becomes the emotional heartbeat of the relationship. The anxious partner takes on the role of the pursuer, pushing for connection, for clarity, for reassurance. They put in the effort to close the emotional distance, even when it feels like trying to hug someone who keeps stepping back. But they keep trying because deep down, they believe if can they just be patient, kind, or understanding enough, the other person will eventually meet them halfway. They confuse inconsistency with potential. Every small act of attention feels like proof that love is still there, even if it comes wrapped in confusion and delay. The avoidant partner, on the other hand, often becomes accustomed to this dynamic. They know, even unconsciously, that the anxious one will show up, that they'll text again, they'll apologize again, that they'll give one more chance even after being dismissed or left hanging emotionally. This creates an unspoken expectation. The anxious one bends and the avoidant remains still. But what the avoidant often misses is that this emotional resilience is not infinite. The anxious partner might bend for weeks, months, even years, but eventually they break. That breaking point is never loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with ultimatums or grand gestures. It arrives quietly, when the anxious person is finally too tired to care more than they are cared for. When they realize their love has become a job. when their kindness is mistaken for weakness, and their emotional honesty is met with discomfort or avoidance. That's when something shifts. The calls stop, the need to explain fades, the effort to fix dies down. It's not because they no longer feel deeply. It's because they've run out of ways to prove their worth to someone who doesn't show up with the same energy. The most heartbreaking part is that the anxious partner often internalizes the entire process. They carry the guilt, the shame, the self-doubt. They wonder if they were too emotional, too needy, too much. But what they were, in truth, was consistent, committed, willing to grow, willing to feel. It's not that they were weak. It's that they were human in a dynamic that asked them to feel for two people. And eventually, even the most emotionally generous person learns that love cannot be sustained through imbalance alone. That realization is what finally allows them to walk away. For the avoidant partner, silence in relationship can often feel like comfort. When things go quiet, they feel like they have space to breathe, to think, to exist without the pressure of someone constantly pulling at them emotionally. They mistake this distance for peace, for control, and for freedom. It's the emotional equivalent of retreating to a personal sanctuary where no one can reach them. And in that space, they feel safe. Safe from the intensity of someone else's feelings, safe from vulnerability, and safe from the overwhelming task of emotionally showing up. But here's where the disconnect begins. While the avoidant partner feels relief in their silence, the anxious partner interprets that same silence as a signal of rejection or abandonment. In their mind, if they don't hear from the avoidant, if they don't receive reassurance, if they don't feel some form of emotional closeness, it means something is wrong. The anxious partner is left in the lurch, desperately trying to fill the void of silence with explanations, apologies, or questions. They want to understand what's happening and why their efforts for connection seem to be met with retreat. The avoidant, meanwhile, grows accustomed to this dance. They pull away and the anxious partner reaches out to fill the gap. The avoidant becomes used to the idea that no matter how much they distance themselves, the anxious partner will always chase, always seek, always try to fix things. It creates a strange sort of security for the avoidant, one where they never truly feel threatened by emotional closeness because they've trained their partner to keep pushing when they pull away. This becomes the rhythm of the relationship, an unspoken understanding that keeps them in their comfort zones. The avoidant stays distant and the anxious stays persistent. But what the avoidant fails to understand is that silence, when it goes on too long, starts to turn into something else. It's not just quiet anymore, it becomes a vacuum, a place where the anxious partner feels abandoned, where their emotional needs are ignored, and where the connection they crave begins to disappear. And eventually, this quiet becomes unsettling, not only for the anxious partner, but for the avoidant as well. When the anxious person stops chasing, when they stop texting or reaching out, when they finally decide they cannot keep fighting for something that doesn't return the effort, the silence becomes defeating. For the avoidant, this moment is jarring. They've lived in the comfort of this emotional distance for so long, but now that distance feels like an absence of something they didn't realize they had been taking for granted, they find themselves alone with their thoughts, facing the quiet that once a refuge, but now a reminder of how disconnected they've allowed themselves to become. What once felt like a safe space now feels like a warning. The absence of the anxious partner is not just their choice anymore. It's a reflection of their own actions. The avoidant begins to realize that the silence they once thought was peace is actually the result of a deeper fracture. It's the collapse of a dynamic that allowed them to avoid intimacy, but now it leaves them facing the consequences of that avoidance, loneliness, regret, and the realization that emotional distance isn't as comforting as it seemed when someone else was always there to fill the gap. Walking away from a relationship is often viewed through a lens of defeat or failure, but for the anxious partner, it can be a profound act of growth. They don't make this decision lightly. Every ounce of their being has been invested in making things work, in believing that love can conquer the disconnect. They've put in the work to heal, to explain, to forgive. But at some point, they come to the painful realization that love cannot flourish in an environment where it's not being reciprocated in equal measure. And so they walk away. Not because they don't care, but because they've finally realized that caring for themselves matters just as much as caring for someone else. For the anxious partner, this decision is rarely a dramatic one. It's not about making a grand exit or leaving with a sense of anger. It's more about understanding that staying is no longer an option that serves their emotional well-being. They've come to terms with the fact that constantly giving to someone who is emotionally unavailable leaves them drained and unfulfilled. They've fought hard for the relationship, but they've also fought hard for their own sense of dignity and self-respect. The choice to walk away is often born out of self-preservation. The anxious partner has spent so much time trying to keep the peace, to fix things, to make their partner feel safe, that they forget what it feels like to be safe themselves. Over time, the emotional toll of always being the one to reach out, to make amends, to rebuild the connection wears them down. They start to feel like they're losing themselves in the process, like their value is being defined only by how much they give, how much they're willing to tolerate, and how much they can stretch themselves to keep someone from walking away. But at some point, they realize that love should feel like a constant state of imbalance. It should not require them to lose themselves in the hopes of gaining someone else's affection. The moment the anxious person walks away is often the result of years of quiet emotional labor. It's when they finally acknowledge that no matter how much they love or how much they give, they cannot change someone who doesn't want to change. They understand that their emotional needs are just as valid as their partners, and it is not their responsibility to hold a relationship together when they are the only one trying. This decision isn't about giving up. It's about taking back their own power. It's about recognizing that their worth is not defined by their ability to fix someone else's emotional world, and that they deserve the same level of care and attention they give so freely to others. The process of walking away can be terrifying. For the anxious partner, it often feels like they are abandoning the very thing they crave most: intimacy, connection, and love. But deep down, they know that staying in a relationship where those needs are unmet is a far worse fate. They understand that true intimacy comes not from constantly chasing, but from being seen and valued for who they are. And so, when they choose to walk away, it is an act of emotional maturity, one that says, I deserve more. I deserve to be in a relationship where I am not only loved but understood. Walking away does not signify weakness. Rather, it signifies the strength to recognize when a relationship is no longer serving their highest good. It is a painful yet empowering moment where the anxious partner begins to prioritize their own emotional health, understanding that love should be a source of joy and support, not just sacrifice. It's a hard but necessary step toward healing, where they let go of hope that they can change the unchangeable and instead focus on the one thing they can control: their own growth and future happiness. The avoidant partner's deepest fear isn't necessarily the risk of emotional intimacy itself, but the vulnerability that comes with it. They fear being exposed, not just in the sense of sharing their emotions, but in the sense of being truly seen and understood. When they allow someone close, they feel the weight of responsibility, not just to manage the relationship, but to protect themselves from the overwhelming sense that they could be hurt, rejected, or consumed. This fear often manifests as a reluctance to engage deeply, a tendency to shut down emotionally, or a desire to keep their partner at arm's length. It's a defensive mechanism designed to guard their own inner world from being disrupted. For the avoidant, vulnerability is like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they crave closeness, even if they don't always admit. They want to feel understood, to experience connection in a way that isn't just surface level, but they're constantly battling the urge to retreat at the first hint of emotional intensity, when they sense their partner pushing for more intimacy. Whether it's through physical closeness, deeper conversations, or emotional transparency, the avoidant begins to withdraw, to distance themselves. They may justify it as a need for space for personal time, or even for self-care. But at the core, it's an attempt to avoid feeling overwhelmed by someone else's emotions. The idea of being engulfed by someone else's needs or desires triggers their most profound anxiety. It's important to note that this fear is often unconscious. The avoidant partner may not realize that their pulling away is rooted in fear, or that their need for space is a form of self-protection. They may genuinely believe they're acting rationally, taking care of themselves, or simply needing to reset. However, the deeper truth is that they are terrified of losing their autonomy, their sense of self. They fear that giving too much emotionally will lead to a loss of their individuality. The more their partner seeks closeness, the more they feel the urge to escape, even if the connection is something they ultimately want. This cycle creates a paradox. The more the anxious partner reaches out, the more the avoidant pulls away. Not because they don't care, but because the intimacy feels like a threat to their sense of control. They feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of being emotionally available or meeting someone else's needs in a way that makes them feel exposed and vulnerable. The paradox is that in their desire to avoid getting too close, they end up creating emotional distance, which then leads to the very emptiness they fear. The avoidant's fear of engulfment isn't always rational. In many cases, the anxious partner does not demand control or emotional dominance, but instead seeks reassurance, love, and connection. However, for the avoidant, even this seemingly benign need can feel like an invasion of their emotional space. They associate emotional closeness with a loss of control, which triggers a deep-seated fear of being overwhelmed or losing themselves in the relationship. They retreat not because they don't love, but because they are afraid of how much the other person's emotional needs could consume them. What the avoidant partner often doesn't realize is that their fear of vulnerability is rooted in past experiences, whether it's from childhood, previous relationships, or personal insecurities. They may have learned early on that vulnerability leads to rejection, or that emotional openness creates an uncomfortable feeling of being too dependent on someone else. This fear, while protective in some ways, can keep them locked in a cycle of emotional distance, never fully allowing themselves the depth of connection they subconsciously crave. Thus, the avoidant's real fear isn't just emotional closeness, it's the vulnerability required to sustain it. When they sense that vulnerability is required, their instinct is to pull away, believing it's the only way to safeguard themselves. They don't always see that true intimacy, far from engulfing them, could actually be the key to breaking down the walls they've built to protect their heart. But for the avoidant, that realization often comes too late when the space they've created feels more isolating than protective, and the love they've been trying to avoid slips further out of reach. The end of a dynamic where one person is constantly reaching out while the other pulls away is not just a breakup in the traditional sense, it is a moment of transformation. For both individuals, the shift that happens when the anxious partner walks away can spark a profound change, one that is often necessary for their emotional growth. While this dynamic may feel devastating at first, especially for the avoidant partner who may experience it as a sudden loss or a wake-up call, it can also serve as an invitation to evolve. When the anxious partner walks away, they do so because they have finally recognized that their emotional needs are just as valid as anyone else's. The years of chasing, explaining, and apologizing have taken their toll, and they can no longer continue investing in a relationship where they are emotionally depleted. For them, walking away is an act of self-respect, a recognition that they deserve to be in a relationship where there is mutual effort, understanding, and connection. This is not a decision made lightly. It is the result of many small moments of disillusionment, of coming to terms with the realization that love should be about more than just effort and sacrifice. It should be about balance, reciprocity, and emotional fulfillment. For the avoidant, the shift may be more jarring. They may not have expected the anxious partner to ever give up. After all, the anxious partner has always been the one to make the effort to show up and to keep trying even when things felt hard. Their constant emotional availability may have given the avoidant a false sense of security, one where they could retreat into their emotional shell, knowing that the anxious partner would continue to chase them. But when that chase stops, when the anxious partner finally chooses themselves, the avoidant is left facing a sudden emptiness, a space that was once filled with someone who loved them deeply, even if they never fully reciprocated it. In this moment, they realize just how much the other person was carrying, how much effort they had been put in to maintain the connection, and how much of that effort had been taken for granted. The end of the cycle represents an opportunity for the avoidant partner to confront their own patterns and fears. This is often a time of reckoning where they must face the uncomfortable truth that their emotional distance has cost them something valuable. It's not just the loss of the anxious partner, but the loss of an opportunity for real emotional intimacy. The avoidant may have spent so long keeping their heart at arm's length, fearing engulfment and loss of independence, that they never fully considered the long-term impact of pushing love away. This moment of realization can be painful, but it's also a critical juncture in their emotional development. They have the opportunity to reflect on why they fear vulnerability and emotional closeness, and to begin the work of addressing those fears so that they can build healthier relationships in the future. For both individuals, this moment of change offers the possibility of growth, even if it comes at the expense of the relationship. The anxious partner may find the strength to set healthier boundaries in the future, to demand the emotional availability and reciprocity they deserve, and to focus on self-care and healing. The avoidant partner, on the other hand, may begin to realize that emotional closeness is not a threat to their autonomy, but a source of true connection and fulfillment. They may begin to see that vulnerability, rather than weakening them, can actually lead to greater strength in their relationships. This period of transformation does not come without pain. It requires both individuals to confront their own emotional shortcomings, their own fears, and their own capacity for change. However, it also opens the door to a more authentic connection, one that is based on mutual respect, emotional understanding, and vulnerability. When both partners are willing to look inward and examine the ways in which they have contributed to the cycle, they can begin to break free from old patterns and move forward with greater emotional intelligence and openness. The end of the relationship, in this sense, is not truly an end at all, but rather the beginning of something new for both individuals. And so, in the end, we see that relationships are never just about two people, but about the dynamics they create together. The anxious partner and the avoidant partner may seem like they are worlds apart, but at the core, they are both seeking connection, just in different ways. The anxious one reaches for closeness, longing to be seen and understood. The avoidant one pulls away, desperately trying to protect their sense of self from being consumed. And yet, when the anxious person walks away, it is a wake-up call, not just for the avoidant, but for both of them. It is an opportunity for growth, a chance for each to face the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. To the anxious partner, walking away isn't a sign of weakness, but of strength. It's the moment you finally choose yourself. And to the avoidant partner, it is an invitation to confront your fears of intimacy, to let go of the walls you've built around your heart, and to learn that love, at its best, is not something to escape, but something to embrace. Remember, we are all capable of change. We are all capable of growth. Sometimes, the hardest part is letting go of expectations, of old patterns, and of the things that hold us back from becoming the best versions of ourselves. But when we do, we create space for new beginnings, for new connections, and for deeper, more authentic love. Thank you for being here today, for being open to these ideas, and for taking the time to reflect on the dynamics of your own relationships. Change begins with awareness, and awareness is the first step toward transformation. So, Take this moment, reflect a reply, and know that the next chapter is always in your hands. Thank you and goodbye. Take care of yourselves and keep growing